I was 52 years old when I realized I had mistaken endurance for love. That morning began like so many others in our house in Evanston, just north of Chicago. Quiet, orderly, almost ceremonial. The lake was steel gray outside the kitchen window, the kind of color that promised rain but never quite delivered it. I stood barefoot on the cold tile, waiting for the espresso machine to finish its familiar groan and hiss, listening to the house breathe around me. For 27 years I had been the keeper of this rhythm. My name is Marianne Holt, and until recently I believed stability was the highest form of devotion. I believed that if I smoothed enough rough edges, absorbed enough uncertainty and quietly corrected enough mistakes, everything would eventually settle into something permanent and safe. I believed that love looked like patience, like silence, like being the one who never panicked. My husband, Caleb, liked to say I was the calm center of his chaos. He said it with admiration but also with relief. Relief that someone else would hold the line while he chased the next version of himself. That morning he wasn't home. That alone wasn't unusual. Caleb had been working late more frequently over the past year, claiming a surge of consulting projects with his boutique architecture firm downtown. I didn't question it. I rarely did. Questioning implied distrust, and distrust felt like failure. Mine, not his. I carried my mug to the dining room, where a stack of envelopes waited neatly aligned at the edge of the table. Utilities. Property taxes. Alumni donation requests from Northwestern, where our son Jonah had just finished his junior year. And one envelope that didn't belong. Cream-colored. Unmarked. No return address. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat down at the table, opened my laptop, and logged into our joint accounts. It was habit more than necessity. I had worked in corporate risk assessment for most of my adult life. Numbers spoke to me more clearly than people ever had. They told the truth without drama. That was when I saw it. A transfer. Modest, almost polite in its restraint. $2,300 moved from our joint savings to an account ending in numbers I didn't recognize. Not a mistake. Not a fee. A deliberate action. I scrolled. There were others. Not large enough to trigger alerts. Not frequent enough to look suspicious to anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. Someone had designed them that way. I felt nothing at first. No racing heart. No heat behind the eyes. Just a small, precise click in my mind, like a lock finally turning. Caleb always underestimated systems. He believed inspiration was more important than structure. He forgot that structure is what keeps inspiration from collapsing under its own weight. I closed the laptop and finally picked up the envelope. Inside was a printed invitation. A reservation confirmation, actually. For a private dining room at the Meridian Room, one of those restaurants that believed intimacy was created by dim lighting and excessive consonants in the menu descriptions. The date was circled in pen. 3 weeks away. The note attached was brief. Not even an attempt at subtlety. After Jonah's internship send-off dinner. It's time to stop pretending. There was no signature. I didn't need one. I sat there for a long time after that, the house still quiet, the espresso long gone cold. I thought about the years I had deferred my own ambitions, turning down a partnership track because Caleb wanted to relocate, shelving my idea for an independent advisory firm because this wasn't the right moment, telling myself there would be time later. I thought about how often I had translated his chaos into coherence. Paid taxes he forgot. Smoothed over burned bridges. Explained his absences to friends with practiced ease. And I thought about how calmly he had planned this. A public ending. A controlled narrative. A moment designed to render me speechless, cornered by politeness and witnesses. What Caleb never understood, what men like him rarely do, is that women like me do not survive by accident. We survive by observation. I folded the invitation carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I opened my laptop again, not to confront him, not to cry, not to spiral. I began a new spreadsheet. By the time Caleb came home that night, smelling faintly of citrus and unfamiliar perfume, I was already several steps ahead. I kissed his cheek, asked about his day, listened as he spoke about deadlines and clients and the fatigue of being misunderstood. He never noticed the way I watched him. He never noticed that I had stopped believing his stories. And he certainly never imagined that the life he was so carefully planning to exit had already begun to reorganize itself, quietly, efficiently, and without his permission. By the time the dinner arrived, I had learned a strange truth about betrayal. It doesn't always feel like a knife. Sometimes it feels like paperwork. The 3 weeks between finding that invitation and the night of Jonah's send-off stretched long and silent, but not in the way grief stretches. Soft, helpless, dissolving. This was different. This was crisp. Organized. A quiet narrowing of focus. I moved through our days the way I always had. Efficiently, pleasantly, with the kind of competence people mistake for contentment. Caleb never suspected a thing. He brought home a new bottle of cologne and told me a story about a client meeting that had run late and loud. He started taking phone calls in the garage, then in the backyard, then on walks that lasted an hour longer than they needed to. He began humming while he texted, an infuriating little tune of triumph that made my skin itch. He was happy. That was the part one hadn't anticipated. Not the affair. Not even the money. The happiness. Men like Caleb didn't usually look happy in the middle of the wreckage. They looked busy. Defensive. Confused. But Caleb looked buoyant. Like he'd finally convinced himself he was the hero in a story that required a villain. And I knew exactly who he planned to cast. The week of the dinner, Jonah flew back to Chicago to pack up his apartment and say goodbye to his friends. He was leaving for a summer internship in Seattle. One of those programs that chose students like they were selecting rare instruments. Careful, prestigious, expensive. I had been proud of Jonah for so long it had become part of my breathing. Caleb insisted we do something special before Jonah left. Something memorable. He suggested the Meridian Room like it was a gift. Like it was his idea, his generosity, his fatherhood. I smiled and agreed. That afternoon, I stood in our upstairs closet staring at dresses like they were costumes from a life I no longer intended to perform. My hands moved automatically. Navy silk, pearl earrings, heels I only wore to events where people pretended to be gentle. In the mirror, I looked exactly like the woman Caleb believed I was. Polished, contained, deferential to the moment. I practiced my face the way some people practice speeches. Not for vanity. For control. Downstairs, Caleb had already opened a bottle of champagne. He poured 2 glasses as if we were celebrating something private. "We did good," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "Jonah's going to be incredible." "We did," I agreed and took a sip. I didn't correct him. If there was one thing I had learned from years in risk assessment, it was that people reveal more when you let them keep their illusions. Interrupting them only makes them adjust. Let them speak. Let them act. Let them believe. The Meridian Room was exactly as I remembered. Soft lighting, heavy drapes, the kind of place that offered you water in 3 different ways and made you feel like you were being interviewed by the cutlery. Our private dining room was set for 12. Jonah arrived first, taller than I remembered somehow, his shoulders squared with that new adult confidence he'd been building brick by brick. He hugged me tightly, kissed my cheek and smiled at Caleb. "You guys look great," he said, glancing between us. "Mom, that dress, wow." "Thank you," I said and meant it more than he knew. Jonah had always seen me. Maybe not fully, not yet, but more than anyone else in that room ever had. The guests filtered in. Caleb's sister Leora, who taught urban planning at DePaul and always seemed slightly annoyed by the world's inefficiency. My colleague Tess Marwick, who drank wine like she was negotiating contracts. Jonah's godfather Gideon Sloan, an old family friend with a soft voice and careful eyes. And then there were the others. The ones who had been in our orbit for years. The ones who hugged me and asked about Jonah and complimented the floral arrangement, all while carrying something behind their smiles. Knowledge. You can feel it when people know something about your life that you don't. Changes the air. It makes every laugh slightly offbeat. I didn't need to search the room to find her. My body found her before my eyes did, like a threat detector built over decades. She sat near the back, angled toward the table but not quite part of it, as if she wanted plausible deniability. Her hair was dark and glossy, cut blunt at her jaw. Her dress was understated, expensive in the way people with new money try to look like they have old money. She held her wine glass too carefully, fingers placed exactly where etiquette books suggested. Her posture screamed effort. She wasn't a 22-year-old mistake. She was a plan. Caleb's gaze flicked to her once, twice, then quickly away. Like a man checking on a fire he'd set. Jonah didn't recognize her. Thank God. He sat beside me talking about Seattle, about his new team, about the view from his soon-to-be office. I laughed at the right moments. I asked questions. I played my part flawlessly because Jonah deserved a good night. Our appetizers came. Then the main course. Then dessert. A ridiculous tower of chocolate and gold leaf that tasted like someone had tried to translate arrogance into sugar. The room relaxed. People always relax when they think the worst thing that could happen has already been avoided. That's when Caleb stood up. He raised his glass, and the sound of it tapping against the crystal pulled the room into immediate, obedient silence. For Jonah, he began, smiling too widely. For his brilliance. His drive. His future. Jonah grinned, slightly embarrassed, the way he always did when attention landed on him. He glanced at me with that quiet, conspiratorial look children give mothers when they're being praised in public. Caleb continued, voice smooth, practiced. Watching you grow into the man you are has been the greatest privilege of my life. He paused. Took a sip. Let the room settle into admiration. Then his eyes shifted, not to Jonah but to me. This moment feels like a turning point, he said, his tone shifting into something else. Something staged. Not just for Jonah. For all of us. I felt Jonah's arm brush mine. A subtle tension, instinctive. Caleb took a breath. His glass remained raised. I've decided, he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, to start a new life without Marianne. The words did something strange. They didn't slam into me. They floated. Hung in the dim light like smoke. For a split second nothing moved. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A server froze near the door, eyes darting. Someone's chair creaked as they shifted in discomfort. And then, slowly, all attention turned toward me with the hunger of an audience that believed it had just been gifted a performance. I saw it in their faces. They expected tears. They expected shouting. They expected my humiliation to unfold with the necessary mess that would absolve them of their complicity. If I fell apart, they could call it tragic. They could pretend they had no choice but to witness. Jonah's face went white. Dad, he started, but Caleb kept going, steamrolling the moment like he always had. We've grown apart, Caleb said. It happens. People change. And I think we both deserve honesty. He smiled at me as if offering mercy. I looked at his glass, at the way his hand trembled just slightly, and I thought, he's excited. He believes this is his heroic monologue. And then I saw her, Caleb's plan, shift in her seat. Her eyes locked onto him with something like impatience. Like she wanted him to hurry up and hand her the keys to the life he'd promised. In that instant I understood everything about the way Caleb saw women. We were roles. Supporting characters. We existed to react. I stood. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Calmly, the way you might stand to adjust a window. I smoothed the front of my dress, feeling Jonah's hand hover near my wrist, like he didn't know whether to stop me or steady me. Caleb's smile tightened. He was waiting. I gave him what he didn't expect. I smiled. Congratulations, I said softly. On your honesty. The room made a sound, not a word, not a gasp, but a collective inhale. Confusion rippled across faces like wind over water. Caleb blinked. Marianne. I didn't let him take control of the conversation again. From my clutch, I removed a sealed envelope. Thick paper. Cream-colored. Heavy enough to matter. I had held it all night like a small secret weight. I placed it beside his plate with the gentleness of a woman setting down a napkin. What's that? He asked, and for the first time his voice lost its rehearsed confidence. Something for you to read later, I said. My tone was polite. Almost tender. Jonah stared at me, eyes wide. Mom. I turned to him and everything in my chest tightened, but I kept my face steady. I kissed his cheek. I am so proud of you, I whispered. This night is still yours. His eyes filled fast, angry tears threatening. He looked between me and Caleb like the room had tilted. Then I turned to our guests. Some of them couldn't meet my eyes. Others looked relieved, like they were grateful I wasn't making them uncomfortable with my pain. One woman, Tess, held my gaze steadily, jaw clenched, as if she'd been waiting for me to do something she couldn't do for me. Please, I said to the room, voice clear and calm, enjoy your evening. I wish you all a lovely night. And then I walked out. Not fast. Not trembling. Not turning back. I moved through the restaurant's velvet hush, past startled servers and curious strangers, past the bar where people turned their heads as if they sensed drama like perfume. The heavy door swung shut behind me, cutting off the first wave of murmurs, those excited, anxious whispers people make when they think they've just witnessed a life crack open. Outside, the night air was humid with lake wind, carrying the smell of rain and car exhaust and something metallic from the nearby tracks. I inhaled deeply. For the first time in months, I felt my lungs expand without restraint. Behind me, the door slammed open. "Marianne." Caleb's voice cracked, high and frantic now. "What the hell is this? What did you do?" I kept walking. The city lights blurred slightly, not from tears but from the sudden, dizzying clarity of freedom. The envelope I had placed beside his plate wasn't revenge in the way people imagine revenge. It wasn't rage or violence or humiliation returned. It was consequence. And it was only the beginning. People assume revenge is fueled by anger. That it arrives loud and reckless, breaking things, burning bridges, demanding witnesses. They are wrong. Real revenge, effective revenge, is fueled by patience. By the kind of calm that only comes when you finally stop hoping someone will become better and start accepting who they already are. I didn't go home that night. I drove past our house in Evanston without slowing down, past the porch light Caleb had installed last fall because he liked the way it made the place look welcoming. I wondered briefly if he had already imagined someone else walking up those steps, keys in hand, believing the house was hers. Instead, I checked into a small hotel near the river downtown. Neutral furniture. Clean lines. No memories embedded in the walls. I slept deeply without dreams, the way I used to sleep before I learned to anticipate disappointment. By morning my phone was full. Missed calls. Texts. Voicemails stacked like dominoes. His sister Leora. 2 friends from the dinner who wanted to check on me. One message from Jonah that simply said, "Are you safe?" I replied only to him. "Okay. None of this is your responsibility. I love you." Then I turned the phone face down and ordered room service. Coffee. Toast. Eggs I barely touched. At precisely 9 a.m., I opened my laptop and logged into a folder labeled Holt. Private. It was the folder Caleb never knew existed. Not because I hid it poorly, but because men like Caleb don't look for what they assume isn't there. For years I had maintained a parallel financial life. Not secretive, just separate. A habit formed early in our marriage, when I realized that loving someone didn't require dissolving myself into them. My salary had always gone into our joint accounts. My bonuses, however, went elsewhere. Invested. Tracked. Quietly growing. Caleb called it my safety net, once, laughing like it was a cute quirk. He never asked how strong it was. The envelope I'd given him contained 3 things. First, a copy of the divorce filing, officially submitted that morning at the Cook County Courthouse. Second, a summary of the financial discrepancies I had identified. Transfers, hidden accounts, expenditures that violated the disclosure requirements of our marital agreement. Third, and most important, the prenuptial agreement Caleb himself had insisted on signing 27 years earlier. Back then he'd been ambitious but unproven. I had inherited money from my grandmother, modest but meaningful, and he'd worried about protecting what he believed would soon be his future earnings. "I just think it's smart," he'd said. "No offense. I'd want the same protection for you." I remembered hesitating. Remembered how unromantic it felt. But I signed. Because I believed him. And because the agreement included a clause he barely skimmed. A fidelity clause. Not dramatic. Not moralizing. Just precise. Infidelity would trigger an unequal division of assets. Including real estate. Including retirement accounts. Including any jointly acquired investments. The clause had no expiration date. Caleb never questioned that. He assumed fidelity was a default setting, not a legal risk. By noon my attorney Raphael Kim had called. "I take it the dinner didn't go as planned," he said mildly. "That depends on whose plan you mean," I replied. He chuckled. The emergency filing went through. The judge approved a temporary freeze on the joint accounts pending review. Caleb will still have access to his personal account. "Good," I said. "That's more than generous." Raphael paused. "You're very calm." "I've had months," I said. He had an hour. I returned home later that afternoon. Caleb's car was in the driveway. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside, charged like air before a storm. A suitcase sat half-packed by the stairs. He'd been preparing to leave quietly, efficiently, without conversation. Predictable. Marianne, he shouted from somewhere upstairs. Where the hell have you been? In control, I said loudly enough for him to hear. He appeared at the top of the stairs, face drawn, eyes rimmed red. The confidence from the night before had evaporated, replaced by something frantic and feral. What is this? He demanded, holding the envelope like it might bite him. You served me with divorce papers? On Jonah's night. I matched your timing, I said evenly. You seem to appreciate symbolism. You blindsided me. I tilted my head. Did I? He stared at me, searching for something. Panic, guilt, regret. He found none. The prenup expired years ago, he said quickly, seizing on the argument he'd clearly rehearsed. Everyone knows that. I smiled. Section 12, I said. Fidelity clause remains in effect for the duration of the marriage. You might want to read the whole document this time. The color drained from his face in real time. You can't do this, he said hoarsely. You're being vindictive. No, I corrected. I'm being accurate. He laughed, then sharp, hollow. This is who you really are. Calculating. I studied him. This man I had supported through career changes, through crises of confidence, through his endless hunger for reinvention. The man who had relied on my steadiness like a crutch and then resented me for not needing one. Perhaps, I said. Or perhaps this is who I've always been and you simply benefited from it. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, swore under his breath. She's asking where I am, he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. Already? He didn't answer. I assume you've told her about the accounts, I added lightly. He froze. You didn't tell her, I said. It wasn't a question. Another buzz. Then another. You really should, I said. Secrets don't age well. I walked past him and into the living room, where I sat on the edge of the armchair and opened my laptop. I had documents to review. Plans to finalize. Behind me, Caleb stood motionless. For years, I had been the one translating chaos into order. Now I was simply withdrawing my services. And for the first time, the life he had built on my silence began to collapse under its own weight. Chaos always sounds louder when you're no longer responsible for containing it. Caleb unraveled quickly after that afternoon. Not dramatically at first. No shouting, no slammed doors. But in the subtle, telling ways of a man realizing the ground beneath him has been quietly removed. He paced. He made calls in low voices that rose despite his efforts. He alternated between fury and pleading with such speed it would have been impressive if it weren't so transparent. By evening he tried reason. Let's not do this through lawyers, he said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen while I prepared a simple dinner for myself. We can sit down like adults and work this out. I didn't look up from the cutting board. We are doing this like adults, I said. Adults use contracts. He scoffed. You're enjoying this. I paused then. Set the knife down carefully. That's the part you don't understand, I said, meeting his eyes for the first time that day. This isn't about enjoyment. It's about relief. He stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. That night he slept in the guest room. Or pretended to. I heard him pacing at 2 a.m, drawers opening and closing, his phone buzzing incessantly. Once I heard him swear, soft, desperate. By morning the story had already begun to change. Friends called. Not to ask how I was, but to clarify. Caleb was telling people I'd overreacted. That I'd been planning this for months. That I was unstable and humiliated by a midlife misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. It was almost admirable how quickly he reached for narrative control. He had always believed the right words could fix anything. What he didn't understand was that words don't work very well against documents. By noon, his sister Leora arrived unannounced. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She took one look at Caleb, unkempt, defensive, already rehearsing his victimhood, and then turned to me. Is it true? She asked. About the accounts? Yes, I said simply. And the woman? Yes. She closed her eyes briefly, then exhaled through her nose. I warned you, she said to him without turning around. Caleb bristled. This is between Marianne and me. No, Leora said coldly. This is about integrity. And you've been bleeding it all over the family. He turned to me. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I nodded. You're saying it now. That afternoon my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered. Mary Ann, a woman's voice said carefully. This is Elaine O'Rourke. I'm calling from the leasing office at the Ashford-on-Halstead. I smiled inwardly. Yes. We received an application listing your husband as a co-lessee, she said. There were some discrepancies we needed to verify. Specifically regarding income and credit. I see, I said. And? Well, she hesitated. After reviewing the information, we're unable to proceed. The application has been denied. Thank you for letting me know, I said warmly. I appreciate your diligence. When I hung up, Caleb was watching me. What was that? He asked. The apartment you promised her, I said. It won't be happening. His mouth opened then closed. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked afraid. Not of losing me. Of losing access. That evening Jonah came over. He didn't call first. Just showed up, shoulders tight, jaw set in a way that made him look older than his 21 years. He hugged me hard. I heard what Dad's saying, he said quietly. I don't believe him. I closed my eyes for just a moment, breathing him in. That's all I need, I said. Caleb appeared in the hallway. Jonah, he began, forcing calm. This is complicated. No, Jonah said, turning to face him. It's actually very simple. You cheated. You stole. And you tried to embarrass Mom in public. Caleb's face hardened. That's not how. Stop, Jonah said. His voice didn't shake. Just stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Caleb looked at me then, not angry, not pleading, but wounded. You turned him against me. I shook my head. No, I said. You did that all by yourself. 3 days later we were in court. A small courtroom. Neutral walls. An older judge with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics. Raphael sat beside me, calm and prepared. Caleb's attorney, a young man with a too large suit and too little experience, kept whispering urgently to him. The judge reviewed the prenuptial agreement carefully. There is no expiration clause, she said, looking over her glasses. And the fidelity provision is unambiguous. Caleb shifted in his seat. Furthermore, she continued, the evidence of concealed accounts and undisclosed transfers is extensive. Her gavel came down. The asset freeze will remain in place pending full discovery. The marital home remains in Mrs. Holt's possession. Caleb exhaled sharply like he'd been punched. As we stood to leave, he grabbed my arm in the hallway. You're destroying me, he whispered. I removed his hand calmly. No, I said. I stopped protecting you. That was when it finally happened. The moment he understood. Not that he'd lost the marriage. But that he'd lost the woman who had made his life function. And there was no clause, no apology, no speech dramatic enough to get her back. Loss doesn't arrive all at once. Comes in waves. Social, financial, psychological. Each stripping away a different illusion. After the hearing, Caleb tried to regroup. I know this not because he told me but because I recognized the pattern. He had always believed that if one plan failed, another, bigger, louder, would save him. He began calling people. Former clients. Old friends. Anyone who might still answer. Most didn't. Word travels fast in a city like Chicago, especially among people who pride themselves on discretion. Affairs can be forgiven. Ambition can be excused. But financial deception, especially when it involves family, has a way of closing doors quietly and permanently. The woman he'd planned to replace me with didn't last long. Her name was Nadine Mercer. I learned that from a voicemail she left on his phone one night while he was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. The phone was on the counter. It lit up. Her name appeared, bright and unapologetic. Caleb, her voice said, tight with irritation, you told me everything was handled. You said the apartment was secured. You said the money was untouchable. I didn't sign up for chaos. I set the phone back down before the message ended. I didn't need to hear the rest. 2 days later she was gone. She left behind a pair of sunglasses on the entry table and a silk scarf draped over the banister like a forgotten flag. Caleb found them that evening and stared at them for a long time, as if waiting for them to explain themselves. She overreacted, he said eventually, voice flat. I nodded. So you keep saying. By then I had already moved out, not emotionally but practically. I packed only what I needed. documents, personal items, a few books that had survived all our moves. I left the rest. The house wasn't mine because of furniture. It was mine because the law said it was, and because I had paid for it with years of invisible labor. I stayed with Leora for a while. Her townhouse near Wicker Park was filled with plants and books and the hum of a woman who had never deluded herself to make someone else comfortable. I slept in her guest room, the window cracked open to city noise, and for the first time in years, I woke without a sense of obligation waiting beside me. Jonah called every night. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he didn't. One evening, after a long silence, he said, "I think I finally see him clearly." I didn't ask who he meant. Clarity, I'd learned, is not something you can force on people. It arrives when they're ready. The full hearing was scheduled for a month later. In that time, the discovery process did what discovery always does. It told the truth slowly and mercilessly. The hidden account wasn't the only one. There were debts Caleb had minimized, projections he'd exaggerated, a business that looked impressive from the outside and fragile from the inside. Without my quiet oversight, without my credit, my planning, my risk mitigation, the structure wobbled. Then it cracked. The judge was thorough. She upheld the prenuptial agreement in full. The house remained mine. So did the majority of the investments and retirement accounts. Caleb kept what he had siphoned away, minus legal fees and penalties, which reduced his triumph to a number barely large enough to sustain the lifestyle he'd promised Nadine. When it was over, he approached me outside the courtroom. He looked older. Not in the way time ages people, but in the way consequences do. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "A terrible one." I studied him for a moment. 27 years of shared history stood between us. Birthdays, losses, long drives, ordinary kindnesses that had once meant everything. "No," I said gently. "You made a series of choices. And you repeated them until they became who you are." He nodded slowly as if accepting a diagnosis. "I hope you're happy," he said. I considered the question. "Not yet," I replied honestly. "But I will be." 6 months later, I stood in a small office overlooking the river, sunlight spilling across a desk that belonged entirely to me. The sign on the door read, "Holt Transitions Group." I specialized in financial strategy for women navigating upheaval, divorce, widowhood, career reinvention. Women who had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that money was something to be managed by someone else. Business was steady. Then it grew. Word of mouth is powerful when it's rooted in trust. Jonah visited one afternoon while he was home from Seattle. He leaned against the doorframe watching me work. "You know," he said smiling, "Dad used to say you were too cautious." I smiled back. He confused caution with competence. He laughed, then grew serious. "I'm proud of you, Mom." I felt it then, not revenge, not triumph, but something far more sustaining. Alignment. The woman I was becoming finally matched the woman I had always been. There was only one chapter left to close. And it had nothing to do with Caleb anymore. The final hearing was scheduled for what would have been our 28th wedding anniversary. I noticed the date the way one notices an old scar, without surprise, but with a brief, private recognition of how much had healed underneath it. By then my life no longer revolved around Caleb's reactions. That, more than any court ruling, felt like victory. The morning of the hearing, I woke early in Leora's guest room, sunlight filtering through linen curtains. The city outside was already awake. Buses sighing at stops, someone arguing cheerfully into a phone, the low hum of a place that keeps moving whether you're ready or not. I dressed carefully but not defensively. No armor. No statement outfit. Just myself. At the courthouse, Caleb arrived alone. No Nadine. No supportive friend. No confidence masquerading as charm. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, though stress had thinned him, but structurally, as if the scaffolding that had once held him upright had been removed. When our eyes met, he nodded. A simple acknowledgement. No hostility left. Just fatigue. The judge was efficient. The prenuptial agreement was upheld in full. The asset division finalized exactly as outlined. There were no surprises left to uncover, no hidden funds waiting to be exposed. Truth, once fully accounted for, is remarkably boring. When it was over, the judge closed the file and wished us both well with the neutral kindness reserved for people whose stories she would not think about again. Outside the courtroom, Caleb approached me one last time. "I won't contest anything further," he said quietly. "I know when I'm beaten." I shook my head. "This was never a competition," I said. "It was an audit." He managed a faint smile at that. "I hope," he said after a pause, "that you find everything you were looking for." I considered him carefully, then answered truthfully. "I already have." That was the last real conversation we ever had. In the months that followed, my life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not louder, not flashier, but truer. Holt Transitions Group outgrew its first office. I hired 2 associates, both women who had rebuilt themselves after being underestimated. We didn't just manage money. We taught literacy, agency, foresight. I watched clients walk in afraid and leave standing taller. I recognized that posture. Jonah visited often. He asked questions, not just about finances but about boundaries, about partnership, about what it means to build a life without outsourcing your integrity. "I think," he said once, "that watching all this changed the way I understand relationships." I smiled. Then something good came from it. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I finally returned to the house in Evanston alone. Not to reclaim it. To release it. I walked through each room slowly, touching nothing. The memories were still there, but they no longer demanded explanation. They had become part of a closed account. Balanced, reconciled, complete. Before I left, I sat at the dining table where I had once opened an envelope that changed everything. I thought about the woman I had been that morning. How careful she was. How loyal. How certain that love meant endurance. I don't regret her. She did the best she could with the information she had. But I no longer needed to be her. The envelope I handed Caleb that night at the restaurant hadn't just been a legal maneuver. It had been permission. Permission to stop shrinking. Permission to stop translating chaos into comfort. Permission to stop confusing silence with strength. In securing my financial future, I reclaimed something far more valuable. My voice. My ambition. My self-trust. I didn't destroy a marriage. I survived one. And in the quiet accounting of my life, that turned out to be the most profitable investment I ever made.